In 1510, a young woman named Elizabeth Denton sat down at a wooden desk in her manor house near London and carefully wrote out her last will and testament. She divided her jewelry among her sisters. She named guardians for her 2 living children. She asked to be buried beside her mother, and she sealed the document with wax, folded it neatly, and placed it inside a drawer in her bedchamber. Elizabeth Denton was not sick. She was not old. She was not preparing for a long journey across dangerous seas. She was pregnant. And in Tudor England, that was reason enough to prepare for death. Today, in most of the developed world, childbirth is one of the safest medical events a woman can experience. The maternal mortality rate in England right now sits at roughly 7 deaths per 100,000 live births. But rewind the clock 500 years to the Tudor period, and the numbers flip in a way that is almost hard to believe. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1 in 40 and 1 in 30 Tudor births ended with the mother dying. And across a woman's entire childbearing life, spanning 6, 8, sometimes 12 or more pregnancies, the cumulative odds were devastating. Roughly 1 in 3 women who reached adulthood died from causes directly related to pregnancy or childbirth. So how did an entire civilization just accept that becoming a mother meant rolling the dice with your life every single time? The answer involves sealed rooms, banned sunlight, eagle dung, and a medical establishment that genuinely believed prayer was more effective than hygiene. This is the story of what it actually meant to give birth in Tudor England. And it is far worse than you think. The first thing to understand about Tudor childbirth is that it was treated less like a medical event and more like a kind of spiritual quarantine. When a wealthy Tudor woman reached the final weeks of her pregnancy, she did not simply rest at home and wait. She entered what was called the lying-in chamber, and once she crossed that threshold, her entire world shrank down to a single room. The lying-in chamber was prepared according to very specific rules. The windows were sealed shut with heavy tapestries or wooden boards. Every crack where daylight might enter was blocked. The idea was to create a dark, warm, completely enclosed space, because Tudor medical tradition held that light and fresh air were dangerous to both the mother and the unborn child. Candles and a roaring fireplace provided the only illumination and heat, often pushing the temperature in the room well past what any modern doctor would consider safe. The floor was covered in thick rushes or straw. Religious images were placed on the walls. A crucifix hung near the bed. And once the woman entered this chamber, she was expected to stay there, sometimes for an entire month before the birth and at least another month afterward. This was not a hospital. This was a sealed, airless, overheated box where a woman would spend weeks breathing recycled air in near total darkness, surrounded by the smoke of candles and a fire that never went out. And the truly unsettling part is that this was considered the best possible care available. And it got stranger from there. The preparations for the lying-in chamber began weeks in advance. The expectant mother's diet was carefully controlled according to humoral theory, which meant she was fed specific foods designed to keep her body in balance. Cold meats and fish were avoided because they were thought to chill the womb. Spicy foods were forbidden because they could overheat the blood. Instead, she was given warm broths, poached eggs, bread soaked in ale, and small portions of boiled chicken. Wine was encouraged in moderation because it was believed to strengthen the blood, though in practice, moderation was a flexible concept, and many women were drinking wine throughout their entire pregnancy. The superstitions surrounding pregnancy in Tudor England were endless and deeply believed. If a pregnant woman looked at a hare, her child might be born with a hare lip. If she was frightened by a fire, the baby could be born with a red birthmark. If she craved strawberries and could not eat them, the child might emerge with a strawberry-shaped mark on its skin. Looking at the moon too long could cause lunacy in the child. Stepping over a grave could curse the pregnancy entirely. And if an expectant mother encountered a disabled or disfigured person on the street, she was supposed to look away immediately because the sight alone could somehow deform her unborn baby. These beliefs were not fringe superstitions held by uneducated villagers. They appeared in medical texts written by university-trained physicians. They were discussed seriously among the nobility. And they added yet another layer of anxiety to an experience that was already terrifying enough, without the added fear that glancing at the wrong animal could ruin your child's life. Men were completely banned from the lying-in chamber. Husbands, fathers, brothers, and especially male physicians were forbidden from entering. Childbirth was considered entirely a woman's domain, overseen by a midwife and attended by a group of female friends and relatives known as gossips. The word gossip, by the way, originally had nothing to do with spreading rumors. It comes from the Old English god sib, meaning a person related to you through God. Essentially, a godparent or a close spiritual companion. These gossips would keep the laboring mother company, bring her food and ale, and pray alongside her during the birth. The midwife was the most important figure in the room. In Tudor England, midwives were licensed by the local bishop, not by any medical authority. Their licensing exam had almost nothing to do with medical knowledge. Instead, the bishop wanted to make sure the midwife was of good moral character, that she would not practice witchcraft during the delivery, and that she would properly baptize the baby if it looked like the infant might die before a priest could arrive. The actual skill of delivering babies was learned entirely through apprenticeship, passed from one generation of midwives to the next, with all the accumulated wisdom and accumulated errors that came with it. Some midwives were genuinely skilled. They understood how to turn a breech baby. They knew which herbs could ease pain or slow bleeding. They had delivered hundreds of children and developed an intuition for when things were going wrong. But others had almost no training at all. And even the best midwife in Tudor England was working in total darkness about the actual biology of what was happening inside the human body. The medical understanding of pregnancy in the 1500s was, to put it gently, catastrophically wrong. Tudor physicians still relied heavily on the ancient Greek theory of the four humours, the idea that the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Pregnancy was understood as a disruption of these humours, and most treatments revolved around trying to restore balance through diet, herbal remedies, and bloodletting. Bloodletting. During pregnancy, that was standard medical advice. The logic went something like this. If a pregnant woman was experiencing swelling, headaches, or fatigue, she clearly had too much blood in her system. The solution was to open a vein and drain some of it out. This was done using a small blade called a lancet, and the blood was collected in a bowl while the physician monitored the patient for signs of improvement. In reality, of course, what they were doing was weakening an already vulnerable woman by deliberately removing the blood she desperately needed. Beyond bloodletting, Tudor remedies for pregnancy complications read like a horror novel written by someone with no medical training and access to a very strange pantry. Eagle dung mixed with oil was applied to the belly to ease labor pains. Powdered coral dissolved in wine was given to prevent miscarriage. A paste made from hare's blood and ground up amber was smeared on the thighs to speed delivery. And if labor stalled entirely, the midwife might tie a piece of snakeskin around the mother's waist or place a magnet between her legs because the drawing power of the magnet was believed to pull the baby out. I mean, think about that for a second. A woman in the most painful and vulnerable moment of her life, and the people responsible for her care are strapping magnets to her body and rubbing eagle dung on her stomach. And these were not fringe treatments practiced by village quacks. These remedies appeared in widely circulated medical texts read by physicians who had studied at Oxford and Cambridge. This was mainstream Tudor medicine. The religious dimension made everything even more complicated. The Catholic Church, which dominated English spiritual life for most of the Tudor period, taught that the pain of childbirth was a direct punishment from God. It traced all the way back to the book of Genesis and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Because Eve had eaten the forbidden fruit, all women were condemned to suffer in childbirth for the rest of human history. Pain during labor was not just expected, it was considered spiritually necessary. To try to eliminate that pain was to interfere with God's judgment. This meant that anything resembling pain relief was viewed with deep suspicion. A midwife who used too many herbal remedies to ease a mother's suffering could find herself accused of witchcraft, because only the devil would try to undo God's righteous punishment. In 1591, a Scottish midwife named Agnes Sampson was actually tortured and executed during the North Berwick witch trials, in part because she had attempted to transfer the pain of labor from a noblewoman to a nearby cat using a ritual. The line between midwifery and witchcraft was razor thin, and it was drawn by men who had never set foot inside a birthing room. And yet, despite the church's official stance, there was an enormous cottage industry of protective charms, amulets, and sacred relics designed specifically for pregnant women. Girdles that had supposedly been worn by the Virgin Mary were passed around from parish to parish, rented out to expectant mothers who believed that wearing the relic during labor would protect them from death. These birthing girdles were among the most prized possessions in English monasteries, and they generated significant income for the monks who controlled them. Some were made of parchment inscribed with prayers. Others were strips of silk or linen said to have touched a holy shrine, and women paid dearly to borrow them, because when the alternative was dying on a straw-covered floor in a sealed room, you would try absolutely anything. The church had a complicated relationship with these relics. Officially, their power came from God, not from magic, so they were considered acceptable. But in practice, the distinction between a holy relic and a magical talisman was almost impossible to define. A piece of parchment covered in Latin prayers that a woman tied around her waist during labor was somehow godly. A piece of parchment covered in herbal symbols that a midwife tied around the same woman's waist was witchcraft. The difference was often nothing more than who had given permission for its use. When the English Reformation swept through the country under Henry VIII and later under Edward VI, these birthing relics were confiscated and destroyed along with the rest of the monastery's treasures. The shrines were dismantled, the girdles were burned, and suddenly, women who had relied on these sacred objects for comfort during the most dangerous hours of their lives had nothing left except the midwife's hands and their own prayers. The Reformation did not replace the relics with better medicine. It just took away one of the few sources of psychological comfort that laboring women had. Now, the single deadliest threat facing any Tudor mother was something that would not be properly understood for another 300 years. Puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, was a bacterial infection that entered the mother's body during or shortly after delivery. It caused raging fevers, abdominal pain, and sepsis, and it killed with terrifying speed. A woman who seemed perfectly healthy after giving birth could be dead within 48 hours. The urgency surrounding baptism added another layer of pressure to an already desperate situation. Tudor Christians believed that an unbaptized child who died would be denied entry to heaven. The baby's soul would be sent to limbo, a grey theological borderland where it would remain forever, never punished but never saved. For a Tudor mother, the idea that her child might die unbaptized was almost as terrifying as the idea of dying herself. This is why midwives were required to know the baptism rite. If a baby was born sickly, blue, or not breathing properly, the midwife had to baptize it immediately, sometimes while the child was still halfway out of the womb. Speed was everything. A few seconds could mean the difference between eternal salvation and eternal exile, at least in the minds of everyone in that room. This pressure created its own set of horrors. There are recorded cases where midwives baptized babies that were already dead, hoping that the sacrament might still count. There are cases where the midwife was unsure if the infant was alive or dead and performed the baptism anyway, just in case. And there are cases where a child survived but was so badly injured during a rushed delivery, performed quickly to allow baptism before the moment passed, that it would have been better to have taken more time and more care. Tudor physicians had absolutely no idea what caused it. They attributed childbed fever to bad air, to an imbalance of humors, to divine punishment, to the mother's emotional state during labor. Some believed it was caused by the retained afterbirth or by milk backing up into the blood. The actual cause, bacteria introduced through unwashed hands and contaminated instruments, would not be identified until the 1840s, when a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis proved the connection between hand hygiene and maternal mortality, and even then, the medical establishment resisted his findings for decades. In Tudor England, the midwife would examine the mother with bare, unwashed hands. She would use instruments that had never been sterilized. The straw on the floor of the lying-in chamber was a breeding ground for bacteria. The sealed windows meant there was no ventilation. And if multiple women in the same village were attended by the same midwife within a short period, childbed fever could sweep through like a plague, killing mother after mother, while everyone around them prayed and wondered what sin had brought God's wrath upon their community. If you are learning something from this video, take a moment to hit subscribe. We cover dark chapters of history like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The other great killer was obstructed labor, when a baby was positioned incorrectly, with the arm or shoulder coming first instead of the head, or when the baby was simply too large to pass through the birth canal. There was almost nothing a Tudor midwife could do. Modern obstetricians would perform an emergency caesarean section, but in the 1500s, a caesarean was essentially a death sentence for the mother. The procedure was performed only when the mother was already dead or so close to death that saving her was considered impossible. The goal was to extract the living child so it could be baptized before it died too. Surviving a caesarean in Tudor England was virtually unheard of because there was no anesthesia, no understanding of sterile technique, and no way to repair the massive internal damage the surgery caused. When labor stalled, the midwife's options were grim. She could try to manually reposition the baby, reaching inside the womb with her hands. She could use hooks or forceps-like instruments, though proper obstetric forceps would not be invented until the early 1600s by the Chamberlen family, who kept them a trade secret for over 100 years. Or she could simply wait, pray, and hope that nature would take its course. The Chamberlen story deserves a moment here because it reveals something deeply ugly about how medicine worked in this era. The Chamberlen family were Huguenot refugees who settled in England and became surgeons. Sometime around 1600, Peter Chamberlen the Elder developed a set of curved metal forceps that could grip a baby's head and guide it through the birth canal during a difficult delivery. It was a genuine breakthrough. It could have saved thousands of lives, but the Chamberlens did not share their invention. They kept it a family secret for 4 generations, over 100 years, treating wealthy patients while the rest of the country's women continued to die from obstructed labor. When a Chamberlen attended a birth, he arrived with a massive ornate box, sent everyone else out of the room, and worked in total secrecy. He even blindfolded the mother so she could not see what he was doing. The family made a fortune from this secrecy. And all the while, midwives across England were losing mothers and babies to the exact problem the Chamberlens had already solved. The forceps were not widely known until the early 1700s, long after the Tudor period had ended. By then, countless women had died needlessly. And that is not a typo, by the way. A family of doctors genuinely hoarded a life-saving tool for a century because it was good for business. Sometimes, nature did resolve things on its own, but sometimes the labor dragged on for days, with the mother growing weaker and weaker until her body simply gave out. In these cases, the midwife might be forced to perform a craniotomy on the dead child, still inside the womb, crushing the skull to extract the body and save the mother's life. The psychological trauma of that experience is almost impossible to imagine. And this brings us to the women whose births were the most closely watched, the most politically charged, and in many cases, the most tragic: the queens. If you were a Tudor queen, your entire value to the nation rested on one thing: your ability to produce a healthy male heir. Everything else, your intelligence, your political skill, your personal charm, none of it mattered if you could not deliver a son. And the pressure was not just social, it was existential. A queen who failed to produce an heir could be set aside, annulled, divorced, or worse. The entire Tudor dynasty was built on the question of succession, and that question was answered in the birthing chamber. Consider Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. Catherine was married to Henry in 1509, and over the next 7 years, she endured 6 pregnancies. Her first child, a stillborn daughter, arrived in January 1510. Her second, a son named Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was born on New Year's Day 1511. The entire kingdom celebrated. Bonfires were lit across London. Wine flowed in the streets. But 52 days later, the infant prince was dead. Catherine's third pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. Her fourth produced another son who was either stillborn or died within hours. Her fifth was another miscarriage. And finally, in February 1516, Catherine gave birth to a healthy daughter, the future Mary I. But Mary was a girl, and Henry wanted a son. 6 pregnancies, 4 dead children, 1 surviving daughter, and a husband who was already looking for a way out. Henry's obsession with a male heir did not end with Catherine. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, faced the same crushing pressure from the moment she became queen. Anne gave birth to a healthy daughter in September 1533, the future Elizabeth I. Henry was disappointed but hopeful. A son would surely follow. But Anne's second pregnancy ended in miscarriage in the summer of 1534. And then, in January 1536, Anne miscarried again, this time a son. The fetus was reportedly about 15 weeks old. The miscarriage happened on the same day that Catherine of Aragon was buried, and some historians believe the emotional shock of that coincidence may have contributed to it. Others have speculated that Anne may have had a blood type incompatibility that made successive pregnancies increasingly dangerous. Whatever the cause, the second miscarriage sealed Anne's fate. Henry had broken with the entire Catholic Church to marry her. He had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. He had upended the religious and political order of the entire country, and she could not give him a son. 4 months after that miscarriage, Anne Boleyn was arrested on fabricated charges of adultery, incest, and treason. She was beheaded on May 19, 1536, inside the Tower of London. She was roughly 35 years old. Think about that for a moment. A queen lost her head, literally, because she could not control something that no human being on earth had any ability to control. The biological lottery of whether a pregnancy produces a boy or a girl, whether a fetus survives to term, whether a mother's body cooperates with the impossible demands placed upon it. These were treated as personal failures, as evidence of divine displeasure, as grounds for execution. Catherine's story is devastating, but it was not unusual. This was the reality of Tudor reproduction. Miscarriage rates were staggering. Infant mortality claimed roughly 1 in 4 babies before their first birthday, and the mothers who survived the pregnancies often suffered permanent physical damage, infections, fistulas, and chronic pain that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Then there was Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, who finally gave him the son he had torn the country apart trying to get. On October 12, 1537, after a labor that lasted nearly 3 days, Jane delivered a healthy boy, the future Edward VI. Henry was ecstatic. The kingdom rejoiced. Jane had done the one thing that 2 previous queens could not. But within days of the birth, Jane fell gravely ill. The most likely cause was puerperal fever, though some historians believe it may have been complications from a retained placenta. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. She developed a high fever, her pulse became erratic, and she slipped in and out of consciousness. On October 24th, just 12 days after giving birth to the heir that England had been waiting nearly 3 decades for, Jane Seymour died. She was 29 years old. Henry was reportedly devastated. He wore black for 3 months, which was an unusually long mourning period for a Tudor king. He later called Jane his one true wife, which was a strange thing to say about wife number 3. But Henry was never exactly consistent in his affections. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Jane's death proved something that every woman in Tudor England already knew in her bones. Being queen did not protect you. Having the best midwives, the finest chambers, the prayers of an entire nation behind you, none of it was enough. If the fever came, or the bleeding would not stop, or the baby was positioned wrong, you died just the same as any farmer's wife in a thatched cottage in the countryside. And Jane was not even the only queen to die in the birthing chamber during this period. Elizabeth of York, the mother of Henry VIII, died on February 11th, 1503, just 9 days after giving birth to a daughter named Catherine. Elizabeth was 37 years old, and she died on her own birthday. The baby, little Catherine, survived her mother by only a few days. Elizabeth of York had access to the finest medical care in England. She gave birth in the Tower of London, attended by the royal midwife and surrounded by the most experienced women in the kingdom. And she still died from what was almost certainly postpartum complications. The Tower of London, with all its wealth and resources, was no safer than a farmhouse when it came to delivering a child. And for the babies who did survive birth, the dangers were far from over. Infant mortality in Tudor England was staggering. Between 20 and 30% of children died before reaching their first birthday, and nearly half did not survive to the age of 10. Disease, malnutrition, contaminated water, and accidents claimed children at rates that would be unthinkable today. Among the wealthy, babies were almost never breastfed by their own mothers. Instead, they were handed over to wet nurses, women hired specifically to feed and care for the infant during its first year or two of life. The wet nurse system was deeply ingrained in Tudor aristocratic culture. It was considered beneath a noble woman's dignity to nurse her own child, and there were practical reasons too. Breastfeeding was believed to delay the return of fertility, and a queen or noblewoman was expected to become pregnant again as quickly as possible. Her job was to produce heirs, not to raise them. But the wet nurse system carried its own risks. The quality of care varied enormously. A wet nurse in a wealthy household might be well fed and healthy herself. But a wet nurse, employed by a lesser family, might be malnourished, sick, or caring for too many infants at once. There was no way to screen for disease. Tuberculosis, syphilis, and other infections could be transmitted through breast milk, and Tudor physicians had no understanding of how or why this happened. For poor families, there was no wet nurse at all. The mother breastfed while continuing to work, often returning to physical labor within days of giving birth because the family could not survive without her income. A woman who had just endured hours or days of labor might be back in the fields or at the spinning wheel within a week, her body still healing, still bleeding, still at risk of infection. There was no maternity leave in Tudor England. There was barely even a concept of recovery. The emotional weight of all this is hard to overstate. Tudor women did not enter pregnancy with the casual optimism that most expectant mothers feel today. They entered it with genuine fear. They wrote their wills. They made arrangements for their existing children. They said goodbye to friends and family members, sometimes formally, because they understood that every pregnancy might be their last. The church reinforced this terror at every turn. Before entering the lying-in chamber, a pregnant woman was expected to confess her sins and receive communion, because she might not get another chance. The prayers recited during labor were not just for a healthy baby. They were prayers for the mother's soul, in case she died before the child could be delivered. And after the birth, if the mother survived, she was considered spiritually impure and was barred from entering the church until she underwent a ceremony called churching, a ritual purification that marked her return to normal society. Churching was supposed to be a celebration, a thanksgiving for surviving childbirth, but it also carried a darker implication. The fact that a woman needed to be ritually cleansed after giving birth reinforced the idea that pregnancy and labor were inherently contaminating, that the act of bringing new life into the world somehow made a woman unclean in the eyes of God. Until she was churched, a new mother could not enter the church building. She could not take communion. In some parishes, she could not even leave her home. Imagine that. You have just survived one of the most dangerous experiences of your life. Your body is broken. You are exhausted, bleeding, possibly fighting off infection. And the church tells you that before you can rejoin your community, you need to be purified, because childbirth has made you spiritually dirty. The class divide in Tudor childbirth was real, but it was not as wide as you might expect. Wealthy women had private lying-in chambers, experienced midwives, and access to physicians if complications arose. Poor women gave birth wherever they could, sometimes in a shared bed, sometimes on a dirt floor, sometimes in a field during harvest season because the work could not stop just because a baby was coming. But the fundamental dangers were the same for everyone. Bacteria did not care whether you were a duchess or a dairymaid. A breech baby was just as deadly in a palace as it was in a cottage. And the medical ignorance that defined Tudor obstetrics applied equally to the royal physician and the village wise woman. They were all working from the same broken playbook. The one advantage that poor women sometimes had, oddly enough, was better ventilation. A peasant woman giving birth in an open-air cottage with drafty walls and no fireplace roaring at full blast was, purely by accident, in a slightly less bacteria-friendly environment than a noblewoman sealed inside a suffocating chamber with no fresh air circulation. The irony is grim, but real. The wealthy women sealed, overheated lying-in chambers were actually more dangerous than the drafty homes of the poor. There were small mercies scattered throughout this bleak landscape. Some Tudor midwives were genuinely gifted healers who had accumulated real knowledge through decades of practice. They understood that cleanliness mattered, even if they could not explain why. They knew that certain herbs, like raspberry leaf and chamomile, could genuinely help ease labor. They had developed techniques for turning breech babies that were surprisingly effective, and they provided emotional support that was arguably just as important as any medical intervention, holding the mother's hand, talking her through the contractions, reassuring her that she was going to be all right. These women saved countless lives. They just did it in the dark, working against a medical establishment that dismissed their knowledge, a church that suspected them of witchcraft, and a biological reality that they could not possibly understand with the tools available to them. One of the most overlooked aspects of Tudor childbirth is the network of support that women built for each other in the absence of real medicine. The gossips who attended the lying-in chamber were not just there to watch. They formed a crucial emotional and practical support system that helped mothers survive, not just physically, but psychologically. These women shared knowledge across generations. They remembered which herbs had worked and which had not. They passed down techniques for managing pain, for calming a frightened first-time mother, for recognizing the warning signs that something was going seriously wrong. In many villages, the local midwife was the closest thing to a trained medical professional that anyone would ever encounter. She attended births, yes, but she also treated fevers, set broken bones, mixed medicines, and counseled women through miscarriages and stillbirths. She was healer, therapist, and community anchor all wrapped into one, and she did all of this knowing that any failure could lead to accusations of incompetence or worse, witchcraft. A midwife whose patients died too frequently might find herself hauled before a church court and stripped of her license. A midwife whose patients died in ways that seemed unusual might find herself on trial for her life. The toll this took on the midwives themselves is rarely discussed. These women watched mothers die. They held babies that would never take a first breath. They made impossible decisions about whether to try to save the mother or the child when it became clear that both could not survive. And they carried that weight with them to the next birth, and the next, year after year, often for decades. There is a surviving letter from a Tudor midwife in Kent, written sometime in the late 1500s, in which she describes attending a birth that went badly. The mother hemorrhaged after delivery and could not be saved. The midwife writes that she washed the blood from her hands, walked home through the rain, and was called to another birth the following morning. She went, because there was nobody else. By the end of the Tudor period in 1603, very little had changed about the fundamental experience of giving birth. The lying-in chamber still existed, the windows were still sealed, men were still banned, and women were still dying at rates that would be considered a national emergency by modern standards. The real breakthroughs in maternal medicine, germ theory, antiseptic technique, modern obstetric forceps, blood transfusions, antibiotics, safe cesarean sections, all of these were still centuries away. To put the gap in perspective, a Tudor woman giving birth in 1550 had more in common with a Roman woman giving birth in 50 AD than she did with a Victorian woman giving birth in 1850. 1,500 years of human civilization had passed, and almost nothing about the fundamental mechanics of keeping mothers alive during childbirth had improved. The candles were different. The prayers were in a different language, but the dangers, the ignorance, and the fear were virtually identical. It was not until the 1800s that maternal mortality began its long, slow decline. Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods in the 1860s. The widespread adoption of hand-washing in hospitals. The development of safe blood transfusions. The discovery of antibiotics in the 1920s. Each breakthrough chipped away at the mountain of death that had defined childbirth for millennia. But the Tudor women who endured the lying in chamber never saw any of it. They were born too early by 300 years. The Tudor woman who sat down to write her will before entering the lying in chamber was not being dramatic. She was being practical. She lived in a world where the act of creating new life was one of the most dangerous things a person could do. And she faced that danger with the same tools her grandmother and her great-grandmother had used before her: prayers, candles, herbs, and the steady hands of whatever midwife happened to be available. When we look back at Tudor England from the comfort of modern medicine, it is easy to feel a kind of distant horror, like reading about a nightmare that happened to someone else. But for the women who lived it, this was not history. This was Tuesday. This was the ordinary, expected, completely normal risk of being alive and being female in the 1500s. And maybe the most unsettling part of all is not how many women died, it is how quietly they accepted it. They wrote their wills, kissed their children, walked into the dark room, and hoped for the best. Because that was all they could do. If this video gave you a new perspective on history, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We have plenty more stories like this waiting for you.